Good afternoon, and welcome to the Lasker Lessons Leadership Series. In this collaboration between the Lasker Foundation, the International Biomedical Research Alliance, and the NIH-Cambridge Scholars Program, we invite leaders into the biomedical field to share their journeys and discuss leadership strategies, responsibilities, and approaches to career development. My name is Jasmine Mack, and I'm a first-year NIH-Cambridge Scholar. Today, we have the gracious opportunity to learn from Mr. Ken Frazier. Ken Frazier is currently the executive chairman of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, Merck. Previously, Ken served as CEO of Merck for 10 years after initially serving as general counsel and head of the human health business for the company. Our conversation will delve deeper into Mr. Frazier's non-traditional career path, starting in law, being the first Black CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, and now having been featured twice on Time's list of one of the most influential people in the world. This event will be live streamed and recorded for future viewing. I encourage you to enter questions into the chat for the Q&A portion of the program. Welcome, Ken. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to learn more about your journey today.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you to the audience for having me.
Thank you. So starting from the beginning, growing up in North Philadelphia, in a neighborhood that might be considered challenging, what was that experience like, and what do you recall as a lasting life lesson as you reflect on those years?
Well, you know, looking back on it, I think I can recognize that it was a neighborhood that was marked by things like poverty. But to be honest, in growing up, because I had such great parents, I thought I had a great upbringing, you know? Now, I do know that the neighborhood was tough. And so one of the first lessons I learned growing up is not to be intimidated, or more specifically, not to show that I was intimidated. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just to give your audience a context, you know, because we're talking about health issues, the stroke rate in Philadelphia is 20 times the national average. And that has to do with all kinds of social determinants, all kinds of social risks that people live with. Poverty, they live with a certain amount of trauma in their lives. And so it was that kind of environment that I was brought up in. But I have to say that, you know, my father was a great role model. My mother died when I was young. And although I grew up in a tough neighborhood, what I remember most about growing up was my father's advice about how to deal with the situation that I was in. And his most important thing that he would remind me of, and he would say it all the time, is he would say, Kenny, you know, what other people think about you is none of your business, or actually he would say none of your damn business. Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to address the peer pressures of growing up in that neighborhood.
I love that. Just focusing on yourself and not worrying so much about what other people are focusing on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I had the pleasure of listening to your interview with 3 8th grade reporters from the DePaul Catholic School from last summer in Philadelphia. And you mentioned that you started as a chemistry major at Penn State. And could you tell us what your driving factors were for switching into law?
So I was a chemistry major because when I went to high school, I went to a special high school that was focused on kids who wanted to pursue careers in science. And so having gone to that high school, which gave me a rigorous education, better than the education I would have gotten in my neighborhood high school, which we can talk about later if you'd like, I just basically thought of myself as somebody who was going to pursue a scientific track. But at the same time, growing up, my biggest heroes were people like Thurgood Marshall, people who had actually led in the civil rights movement. So I was always torn between, okay, I went to high school very much focused on, you know, sort of chemistry and biology, physics, et cetera, versus what I wanted to do as a lawyer. And ultimately, I think my desire to do something about social justice won out over my interest in science.
Wow, that's wonderful. So thinking back to being a lawyer and going into being Merck's CEO, could you tell us a little bit more about that trajectory and how did it come to be?
Oh, it's completely random. And I think often when I'm talking to people, people say, how do I plan my career? My career is an example of how much serendipity there is in life. And, you know, frankly, for me, it was always, what can I learn? What can I pursue? What can I stretch? What can I grow? I was not just a lawyer, I was a trial lawyer. I love that. I think, you know, there's almost nothing more exciting than jury trial work. And, you know, I went from, you know, for example, representing people under sentence of death to coming to a corporate environment, which couldn't be much more different. But I think what the two things have in common is advocacy. Mm-hmm. And if you believe in what you're doing and you can actually help explain that to people, that was essentially what brought me to Merck, was my first important job here at the company was being the company's spokesperson, and it reminded me a lot of what it meant to be a jury trial lawyer. It's actually explaining complicated things, for example, science, to people in a way that they could understand.
So could you also follow up the role of mentorship in your pursuit from being a lawyer to being a part of the C-suite at Merck?
Yeah, absolutely necessary. Mentorship and sponsorship, which are two different things. Mm-hmm. So I have to say that I had the great good fortune of coming to this company and working for a very terrific leader, CEO named Roy Vagelos, who's known to many people on this call. And Roy hired me to be, again, the company's head of what was then called public affairs, which was sort of communications and lobbying and public policy and things of that nature. But during that first 2 years, I got to work relatively closely with Dr. Vagelos. And having access to him on a regular and frequent basis gave me a perspective of how I should think about leadership in the context of a company like Merck. And I often say on my best day here as CEO, I was simply, to some degree, imitating what I learned from my exposure to Dr. Vagelos. So that's the importance of mentorship. But the other thing that we talked about is sponsorship. You know, it's one thing to mentor a person and help them grow and develop. It's another thing to take a stand for that person. And so he also took a stand for me. I'm a lawyer by training, but he said, no, you can do something other than being a lawyer. Whereas I think most people in the company would have said, okay, he's a lawyer, he's going to stay in the legal department until he leaves. That sponsorship was really important. And I think it's important as we think about developing people that are, for example, presumptive outsiders because of the fact that they may be of a different race or they may be from a different area of expertise. It's important to keep in mind that those of us who are insiders have an opportunity to expand and include many of the people who are presumptive outsiders.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch a little bit about being an outsider or I guess on a marginalized group, for example. So as you've worked in both the legal and pharmaceutical spaces, from studying at Penn State and retiring as the only Black CEO at a major pharma company, how have you addressed or confronted being the only in the classroom or a meeting table or a lawyer in a courtroom? And how would you advise other aspiring leaders from marginalized groups on trailblazing in their career, essentially?
So I have to say, again, coming back to the beginning where we talked about my upbringing, I feel extremely fortunate to have had parents who instilled a great deal of confidence in me, that I could do anything as long as I worked very hard. And I gave you that comment about my dad saying, what other people think about you is none of your damn business. The context in which he was saying it when I was a kid was he didn't want me to fall prey to peer pressure and what other people in my neighborhood thought about me. But that applies here too, to what we're talking about. They talk about this phenomenon called stereotype threat, where people who are in a particular context, let's say a context like Merck, often feel the stress and pressure that's associated with knowing that they come from a marginalized group, a group to whom sort of negative stereotypes are attached. And people who are from sort of majority groups don't really understand the pressure and the stress that puts on people because they feel that if they fail, they are failing on behalf of the group, or they're actually given credence to the stereotypes that are associated with the group. I think I was the beneficiary from the time I was a kid of supportive family and a supportive community that constantly reinforced for me that I could do anything that I wanted. And whether it was in the practice of law, I had great mentors. There was a great African-American lawyer named Bill Coleman, who was first in his law school class in 1943. He wrote the brief in the Brown versus Board of Education case. He was my mentor, which didn't mean that he was nice to me. It meant he was very tough on me, but he also kept reminding me that I could be a first-rate lawyer. And the same thing when I came to Merck. So I guess the point I'm making is, it's not what other people think about us that's the issue when we're marginalized. It's what we think they're thinking about us that can be disabling. And so it's really important to have that sense of your own power, that sense of your own agency, that sense of your own potential, which fortunately I got from the time I was a little kid because people impressed upon me that I could do anything that I wanted to do.
That's a beautiful message. And speaking to how support really can change your trajectory and thinking about your career and your the success and accomplishments you've made. So thinking about...
Well, I've been lucky.
Yes.
You talk about the accomplishments. The point that I want to make is, I'll start back, with my schooling. My younger sister and I are the 8th and the 9th of my father's children, and the 2nd and 3rd of my mother's children. We're the youngest in the birth order. And we came along at a time when the social engineers in Philadelphia were engaged in a policy they called school desegregation, which is different from integration. What it really meant was that a small number of select African-American kids were going to be put on buses and sent to the best schools. And so I'm very cognizant for the rest of my life that I got opportunities that were extraordinary compared to other kids in my neighborhood. So every time someone talks about my accomplishments, I have a sense of being an imposter because I really link back to the fact that I got those opportunities. And I believe that talent is much more widely distributed in our society than opportunity is.
Yes.
So I was one of those few kids in that neighborhood who got those special educational opportunities. Again, when I came to Merck, because I worked for a great CEO, Dr. Vagelos, and then other sponsors, subsequent CEOs, Ray Gilmartin and Dick Clark, who took an interest in my development, I got opportunities to show what I could do. And the point I'm making is that, yes, I had to earn certain things, but I didn't earn the opportunity itself. The opportunity is either given or it's not given. Okay.
No, that's a really great addendum, because thinking about the abundance of talent and the limitation of opportunity that's available, I actually wanted to go into hiring of marginalized scientists. I remember you mentioning in another interview about difficulty in hiring those from underrepresented groups with PhDs in genetics, biology, and chemistry. And I was hoping you could share from Merck the type of initiatives that you've pursued to address the hiring disparity.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about the hiring disparity, we have to go back and say, what is the root cause here? I think the root cause here comes back to this educational disparity that I was talking about before. In order for people to be eligible to be hired into the kinds of positions that you were talking about, they have to be given a really rigorous, fundamental education in science and in mathematics. And that's not available. I mentioned being bussed out of my neighborhood and thinking I wanted to be a chemistry major because I went to a high school that was very much focused on that. Mm-hmm. So for many people, it's a couple of things. It's making sure that the quality of the education they get, particularly in their formative years, is what it needs to be to provide that substrate, that foundation that they need. But it's also encouraging them to think of themselves as people who can have careers, right? So for minorities and women, there are little subtle things that discourage them from thinking about themselves as future scientists. And so we have to work on both the quality of the education, but also to help people become interested in careers and to believe that they can have careers. So one of the things that we have here is that a lot of the scientists in the company are actually going out into the community and mentoring young children to actually help them see themselves. Particularly, for example, African-American scientists are useful because the kids can say, hey, there's somebody who looks like me who's doing this thing. Mm-hmm. Even I talked about Dr. Vagelos. He likes to share the story that his mother and father ran a luncheonette across the street from the Merck plant. And this Merck scientist would come in at lunch. And when he was a young person, he overheard their conversations. And that's what got him really excited about science and interested. And of course, the rest is history. But that's another indication of people's exposure to other people who are in those fields is really important. So that's one of the things we're doing. And then, of course, we work with historically black colleges and universities to provide support to people and things of that nature. But I do think fundamentally the issue is around improving access to the kind of scientific and mathematical education that one needs in order to pursue this kind of career.
Very important. And I also wanted to highlight another initiative. I read about the 1 million hiring of black workers.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that?
So that's a little different from what we were just talking about in the context of science. But one of the things that I have been working on for the past year and a half is following the tragedy of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. A lot of companies were asking the question, what can business do to address some of these long-standing disparities that exist in our society that affect particularly African Americans. African Americans are affected by things that are affected by lots of other people. I'm not saying that lack of opportunity is only characteristic of African Americans, but I do think what's special about the case of African Americans is that we can trace a lot of today's issues, a lot of today's inequities, back to slavery. And I think when the George Floyd thing happened, a lot of companies were asking, well, what can we do to try to create a situation where we don't have the average African American family having wealth that's less than 1/10 of the average white family in our country, which is what the data shows. And so as we were having that conversations, it became really clear that the one thing that's in our wheelhouse, the one thing that corporate America can do is hire people. And so if you look at the census data from 2020, something like 78% of African Americans at age 26 do not have a 4-year college degree. And when these companies, there's 70 or so in this coalition, which is called 110, which aims to hire, upskill, as well as retain and then advance African Americans without a 4-year degree in corporate America. When those 70 or so companies looked at their own hiring criteria, what they saw is that 90% of their jobs, including entry-level jobs, required a 4-year degree. So you have 78% of these people not having a 4-year degree, and 90% of the jobs requiring a 4-year degree. You have this obstacle, which isn't necessarily intentional on the basis of race, but it has a disproportionate effect on African Americans. By the way, only 40% of all Americans have a 4-year college degree. So you're not just excluding 78% of African Americans, you're excluding 60% of everyone. So the point of 110 is to get these companies to be focused, where appropriate, on skills. We should be focused on skills-based hiring, not credentials-based hiring. And when we get companies to focus on that, what the data shows us is that if you focus on skills-based hiring, you get a much bigger population of people who are eligible. Those people are much more loyal. They work very hard on these jobs. And actually, they're more successful at their jobs if they have the right skills entering versus having some credential, which may or may not be relevant. So that's what we're looking at, is if we can now lower the desire of companies to have as an entry criteria 4-year, or eliminate that desire in the right jobs, we're not lowering the standard for the job. To the contrary, we're actually getting people to be focused on what are the skills necessary to do that job. We think we can create more opportunity. And I'll just say very quickly before I stop here, one of the single most important things in getting rid of the intergenerational pathology and poverty that affects the African American community is economic stability. And economic stability comes from jobs. And young kids grow up in homes, if their parents, like my father was a janitor, he had a 3rd grade education, but he went to work every day and he held his head up high. And so I saw what the work ethic looked like. I saw what dignity came from having a job. And so if kids see that every day, that will actually change how they think about themselves in the world. I'm sorry I took too long.
No, that was perfect. Outreach, awareness, and making it known. I feel like those are really important things to consider in terms of fixing the leaky pipeline, I would say, from bachelor's even to PhDs, and even just in the workforce, as you mentioned. And given your passion and your motivation for, I guess, your commitment to social justice issues, and I remember you speaking before about, as being one of the only few Black CEOs, you felt compelled to speak out about these types of issues. And I know that it can be a complicated decision, especially like double consciousness is what I think about, and how it might affect your career or things in the future. How do you decide when to lend your voice to a particular issue?
So that is a tough issue, particularly right now in our society, because our society is so divided. And often when you weigh into an issue, you know that you're going to alienate a lot of people. They could be some of them could be your customers, some of them could be your employees. So one has to think very carefully about when one decides to speak up on an issue. But for me, it has always been, first and foremost, is this an issue that I feel compelled to speak out about? And I will be honest, I think being one of the few African American CEOs, I probably feel often that an issue calls to me differently than maybe it calls to other people. The next question, and this is very important, is it an issue that really relates to the company's core values? So some of the things that I've spoken out about might have been viewed as controversial by some people, but actually I think it really comes down to core values. So Charlottesville, was one of those situations where I felt compelled to say something as a matter of my own personal conscience, but also before I put out a statement out about dropping off the president's business council, I actually called my board and I said, I'm going to drop off this business council because of what transpired in Charlottesville and what the president's comments did and did not say about our values as a country. But do you want me to speak also to Merck's corporate values? Because I don't have to say I'm doing it as the CEO of Merck. I can say I'm doing it as a matter of personal conscience. I'm very proud to say that my board unanimously said, no, we actually want you to speak to the company's values, not just to your personal values. So for me, the questions are, what is the importance of the issue to you? What is the importance of the issue to your company? Can you actually have an impact if you speak out? Because if you speak out about everything, you don't have an impact after a while. And if you actually put it through that sort of lens, then you can feel like you can speak up. And the last thing I would say is I try to stay out of political issues. I don't think it's my job to tell my employees or anybody else what to think about pure politics. But a lot of issues that are politicized, like science, for example, or voting rights, are not intrinsically political issues. Some people may choose to try to put a political frame on those issues, but for me, these are fundamental issues that go to what it means as Americans to live in a democracy and to be rational, tolerant, hopefully enlightened people.
I think it's really inspiring. I feel that you've wrapped up advocacy in your leadership style. And I wanted to think more about, what do you think makes someone a good leader, especially given your extensive experience with leading efforts at Merck?
That's a really complicated question, and I could approach it from a lot of different ways. But I'll start by saying, I think most leaders who actually have followership have a sense of purpose. The people that I look to, I talked about Thurgood Marshall. He was animated by a sense of purpose in everything he did, or Dr. Martin Luther King. I think the most important thing for a leader is to want to serve a larger purpose rather than having people serve the leader. When I became CEO of Merck, I remember thinking to myself, what would make a company full of incredibly intelligent people who have their own free will and their own autonomy, what would make them want to bestow upon me the gift of their followership? Why would they follow me? And the only answer that I could ever come up with had nothing to do with me as a person. It had to do with the values of the company. If I was willing to reinforce and embody and support the values they already have, then I had an opportunity to perhaps be viewed as a leader. So I think a lot of it is self-awareness, and are you leading for a purpose greater than yourself? But there's a lot of things you can say about leadership, but those to me are the core of what I think it comes down to.
That's amazing. Thinking also about, I guess, servant leadership and how you want to serve others, and in that way that makes you a leader. I really like the flipping of thinking about that. So over your career, I want to switch to thinking about work-life balance. Like, how do you maintain balance, especially given, I'm sure being a CEO is a very high pressure environment, or can be, and what has kept you grounded during that time frame?
So I'm going to give you the honest answer to that question, which is I've never actually achieved work-life balance. It's got enormous rhetorical appeal. Let's talk about work-life balance, but I've never achieved it. And, each person has to decide for themselves how they apportion their time. The one thing in life that we know we have a limited amount of, for sure, is our time. And for me, I've just been very fortunate that I have great children. I have a great spouse that have allowed me to take on a lot of the challenges. I talked about, for example, when I was a lawyer doing death penalty work. You don't do that part-time. You have to be all in. If you do a job like CEO of Merck, you have to be all in. And so, I tried to spend time with my family. I wish I had done a better job of it than I actually did. So I just want to be honest about that. Yeah. So I'm not a role model for what people call work-life balance. You ask what keeps you grounded. Mm-hmm. It's things like, your faith, your family, your community. So I'm very fortunate to be married to a woman who is both supportive and very direct. And she's constantly reminding me that I need to get over myself.
Wonderful. So I want to ask a more serious question about one of the issues I'm very passionate about, thinking about for the United States having the highest healthcare expenditure in the world, but we have many health indicators that show that we're lagging behind similarly developed nations. And one pertinent example is maternal mortality, and where Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people are more likely to die in the perinatal period compared to their counterparts. And these disparities have been exacerbated during the pandemic. I was hoping you could touch on the initiatives that are being undertaken through the Merck for Mothers program, yeah, especially centering the community partnership for collective action on these types of issues.
So let's just take a step back before we get just to maternal mortality, which I know is something that you're focused on, both the genetic and the environmental factors that lead to those disparities that you talked about. Studies show that 80% of health outcomes relate to social conditions, and only 20% really sort of relate to what we would call clinical care, right? And so the maternal mortality disparity that you just talked about, for example, between Black women and white women in New York City, I think it's like almost 3 times the rate of maternal deaths for Black women versus white women. And it sort of doesn't matter if you control for education. A lot of that has to do not with the genetic part of what you're studying. It has to do with the lived experience of being a Black woman, right? I can just share my own personal story. My wife, when she delivered my oldest child, my daughter, she had a brain hemorrhage, a brain bleed. And she kept trying to tell the doctors that something was wrong. And they kept saying to her, it's sort of a postpartum situation. And she was actually, fortunately, it was a very slow brain bleed. And you heard Serena Williams tell a very similar story about her situation. And people present and they have high blood pressure and they have cardiovascular issues, and that's a result of diet, and it's a result of lifestyle, and it's a result of living in high stress situations. So I guess to answer your question, what we've tried to do at Merck is we have this program that we call Merck for Mothers, and we've been able to provide better health care for 13 million mothers around the world. We really focused on, in the US, having safer childbirth cities, and that's really around making sure that the US, which by the way ranks 47th in the world when it comes to maternal mortality. We're the richest country in the world, and there's 46 countries that are better at this than we are. It's hard to believe that. To make sure that we provide the kind of support that mothers need, educational support, access to the right kind of treatments. Scientifically, we've been working on making sure that we can help create heat-stable versions of the drugs that are used for bleeding when women have excess bleeding when women have children around the world. So there are a lot of things that we're doing in this area in maternal mortality. My colleague, Dr. Atebe, who runs this program, is well known around the world for the work that we're doing. And I think we're making an impact in terms of helping more women have healthy childbirths, in the US and around the world.
This is one of the, I think, flagship kind of programs where pharmaceutical company is partnering with the community and making a difference in that way. I think that it's a really great model to think about, especially in the United States where things are kind of getting out of hand.
They are.
Yes, very much so.
We saw in the pandemic a huge disparity in the amount of deaths in different subgroups, particularly, for example, Hispanic and African Americans, and who tend to be more on the front lines than others. have less access to health care. And again, pre-existing conditions that we have to address. I think one of the challenges for business is going to be to develop the right kinds of business models that allow us to address some of these so-called social determinants of health, right? Because, you know, for example, my spouse and I were working on cardiovascular health in my old neighborhood. I talked about the difference in the stroke rate. And so we've put a center in there, and so there'll be some clinical care, there'll be some dietitians, things of that nature. But the real problem, for example, is food insecurity. It's having access to food. The neighborhood is a food desert, right? And you know, the fact of the matter, as long as it's cheaper to feed a family of 5 at McDonald's than it is anywhere else, you're always going to have people with the kinds of wrong diets that are going to lead them to show up when they have a stroke. What we want to do is we want to give people the access to the right kinds of food and the education to allow them to make the right choices from the time they're teenagers. Because as you know, this is a condition that gets developed over a long period of time. So that's just one example. We need to come up with business models. You know, I'll just give you another example of what we're talking about. I mean, we spent a lot of effort to have electronic health records so that clinical data can be shared from one doctor to another. But if social determinants of health are 80% of health outcomes, we don't have the equivalent data, demographic data, and other data that would allow people to actually address some of these issues around education, around housing, around food, around all of these other things that are going to contribute in the long run to whether or not a particular person has a healthy life.
Thank you for speaking about that. It means a lot to me. And I wanted to, I know we're coming on time for the Q&A, ask a couple more questions before we head that way. So you might have already answered this, just to clarify. So when you look back over your career as CEO of Merck, what was one of the toughest decisions you had to make?
Well, one of the toughest decisions that comes to mind all the time is that less than a month into the job, I had to make a decision about whether or not the company was going to live with its long-term earnings guidance to Wall Street. We had 3.5 years left of long-term guidance. And I felt that if we stayed with that guidance, we could have done it, but it would have required fairly large and I felt indiscriminate cuts in the company's operations and in particular in the research and development budget of Merck. And so I thought we had a very plain choice between either giving Wall Street the numbers that we promised or maintaining the heritage of Merck, which is around R&D. So we made the decision to go to the street and say we couldn't honor that promise of long-term earnings growth. The street wasn't very happy with that. You don't always make your board happy when you surprise them in your first month with that kind of thing. But looking back on it, it was a hard decision, but I think it was the right decision for a company like Merck that says that it is, at its heart, a science company.
Conversely, what would you think is your greatest accomplishment throughout your career?
Well, that's really hard to say. You mean at Merck?
It could be anything.
Well,
yeah.
So everything that happened at Merck, I have to say, I don't believe in what's called the narrative fallacy, which is the CEO has done these things. These were done by Merck people, right? So I want to be 100% clear about that. CEOs get credit, I think, far too much credit when things go well in a company like Merck, and so I'm really honoring the work that's been done by my colleagues, particularly my scientific colleagues, who've changed, for example, how cancer is treated in this country, in the world, right? If I had to pick one thing that I'm most sort of individually proud about, it's one of those death penalty cases where I had a client who was 13 days before his execution date, and eventually he became a free man. So I felt a little bit like my own ownership of having represented that person.
Wow, and it's so great to see an immediate impact of your work.
Yeah, it only took 10 years to get this, but he was on death row for 19 years for a crime he didn't commit.
Oh, wow. So I want to switch over to questions from the audience. And one of the first ones that came in earlier is about how do you scale leadership and how has your perspective on leadership evolved from, being a student, lawyer, CEO, et cetera?
So scaling leadership is an interesting concept. I guess the way that I think about it is when you're running a company that is as global and has so much expertise in it as a company like Merck, I think the only way that you can scale it is to push power down, to push decisions down inside the company. Because there's really no way someone can run a company that is complicated and as interdependent and global as Merck is. So for me, it's not as much about scaling it as it is making sure that you actually distribute the power inside the company so that it's in the hands of the people who can actually do what needs to be done. So if you're the CEO, for example, on the org chart, you're the farthest person from the research bench. You're the farthest person from the customer interface. You're the farthest person from the manufacturing plant. So the question is really, how do you empower your people who already know what needs to be done to do what needs to be done? That's how I think about it. And as far as going from college to being a lawyer to being a CEO, each one of those things is different. When I was a lawyer, I was much more individually responsible for how I tried a case in front of a jury than I am in a case like inside Merck, because the business of Merck is inventing drugs, manufacturing them at scale, and making sure that they're provided to the right patient at the right dose at the right time. You can't do any of those things behind the CEO desk. All you can do is create environments where people who have the skill and the knowledge feel empowered to do those things and do them consistent with the company's sense of purpose.
I'm really glad that you touched on empowerment and instilling that into the people who might be under you and helping with those leadership efforts.
It's a problem in society, by the way. Too often we're taught to look up to our so-called leaders to solve our problems, when the problems are in our own communities, and we have the power and the agency to make a difference in our own communities.
Thank you. So how do we address the racial, ethnic, gender disparities in the corporate boardrooms and the executive level, which seems like one of the last areas resistant to integration?
It's a really important question. LinkedIn did a study a few years ago that I thought was really interesting, because what it showed is that when people fill positions in the C-suite, when they fill positions in the boardroom, often what they do is they assemble a group of people, a pool of people who have the requisite qualifications. But very often, maybe more often than not, the person who's actually selected is a person who has the right social network. And I think that whole issue around who has social capital inside a company and those social networks are really important. I started off by saying, I am only here because Roy Vagelos, who was the CEO of Merck, plucked me out of a law firm when I was in my 30s and gave me an opportunity to come into this company. He had no reason to pick me other than he thought maybe I was a good lawyer, but then he brought me in and said, I'm going to give you a chance, an unexpected chance to do more than being just a lawyer inside the company. So for me, I think this is all about the consciousness of those of us who are inside these companies, who have the ability to make or break people's careers. Right. So we early on talked about my educational opportunities. I think, for example, for African Americans in particular, they face two distinct kinds of gaps. The first one I call the opportunity gap, which is, where did you go to school and all of those kinds of things. But the second one is what I call the access gap. Do you have access to the kinds of people who can help you develop and can help create your career? So I think until companies get very intentional about looking at how they actually progress people into the C-suite and into the boardroom, and until they're willing to challenge themselves when they see these disparities, then the process is going to produce the same thing. I'll just use one little amusing story, at least I think it's somewhat amusing, is I go around and lots of times I'm on a stage talking about diversity, and somebody earnestly turns to me and they'll say, Ken, could you just tell us what the business case for diversity is? And I often respond by saying, I will, but I want to point out that no one has ever been asked to make the business case for homogeneity. And often in the audience, you'll hear a little snicker, But what they're recognizing for the first time is the normative case isn't diversity. You need to justify bringing somebody like me into the room. And as long as there's a requirement to justify that, then we have to go back to all the things we talked about earlier with respect to stereotype threat and the fact that you belong to a group that is not viewed as a group to have the virtues necessary to fully participate in the company or in the country.
Another question I wanted to hit on is about the pandemic. And how do you think that the pandemic has changed the industry over the last 2 years? And what impacts do you think we might experience in 5 years, and maybe a decade or even 20 years from now?
Well, one of the things that I had hoped for, although the data doesn't bear it out, was that in society people began to appreciate why it's important to have an industry like this that invests in fundamental science, because when the pandemic came along, we didn't have therapeutics or vaccines for COVID-19, which no one had ever been exposed to. And I think that's sort of, that public esteem is starting to melt away. But what I think the industry learned, for this, first of all, is the importance of partnership between companies and between companies and the government. I think we also learned the ability to, again, working with FDA and others to try to speed up some of the things we can do without compromising patient safety. I think the most important thing that we learned as an industry and as a country is how critical it is to make sure that these inventions that we develop get to everybody. And by that I mean to say that we have to overcome some of the misinformation and disinformation that exists in our society, for example, about vaccine safety. That if we don't address that substrate, right, and it's not only an issue with respect to COVID-19 vaccines, you see the data that as a result of all the discussion about the COVID-19 vaccines, parents are less willing to vaccinate their young children against measles, mumps, and rubella, and other things that for years people had done. So one of the things I think we have to learn is figuring out how we can address some of the persistent misinformation and disinformation in our society.
I'd also want to think about like the equitable distribution of vaccines. And
Excellent, fair point.
I wonder, how do you see this issue being addressed, especially thinking about African countries that are less likely have vaccinated people versus here? How do we scale that up?
I'm glad you raised that. I should have mentioned that because I was much more focused on the U.S. in my answer. But that is a huge issue. I mean, we're talking about a virus that knows no borders and no boundaries. And while people in the U.S. and Western Europe reasonably got access to these vaccines in a reasonable period of time, we haven't figured out how to manufacture them and make them available at scale in the entire world, in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and a lot of other places where people need those vaccines. There's no simple answer to that question, so I won't provide a simple answer, but I have to say again, we have to be intentional about thinking about the entire world when we have this kind of pandemic, which is of course a global challenge.
Yes, definitely, absolutely.
I will say I'm very proud that, for example, when Merck came forward with its therapeutic for COVID-19, we very quickly entered into voluntary licenses all around the world to make the drug available. That's the kind of thing that companies can do. I see Pfizer has done something very similar with respect to its products. So those voluntary licenses are a means of getting these great inventions out to as many people in the world as we possibly can.
Open sharing, for sure, yeah. So another question that came in is about cancer. So under your leadership, Merck pioneered immunotherapy in cancer. What were the critical decisions you made to facilitate this innovation? Well,
I have to say there were two. First of all, we brought into the company people who understood this field very closely. This is all about, again, goes back to my point about the narrative fallacy. It wasn't under my leadership as it was under the scientific leadership in place in the company. So I want to make that point. First of all, the recognition of the ability to harness the immune system to make a difference for these patients was really one that was made by our scientific leadership. If I had a role it was to allocate sufficient capital to allow them to do the studies, right? We had pending at one time 1,800 studies, right? Wow. That's very expensive to have that 1,800 studies. So my job was to make sure that they had access to the kind of capital that they needed to actually fully develop the drug. And I'm very pleased that Keytruda is now indicated for 33 indications across 16 tumor types plus 2 genetic biomarkers that go across tumor types. That makes me very pleased to see that we're helping a lot of people around the world. We just treated our 1 millionth patient, for example.
Wow.
And that's really terrific. But I want to come back to what I was saying. It was the scientific leadership that made the difference.
So what steps do you think researchers and pharma companies can take to increase access and utilization of emerging drugs, treatments for marginalized groups?
Well, I have to start by saying that I think that that's, going back to what we were saying before, it's part of this whole question of access to better health care generally. It's not just our drugs and our interventions, right? So if we're not able to give people the education, the health literacy that they need to, for example, diabetes, right? So drugs can play a role in keeping diabetics healthy, but it's not the only thing that they need in order to be healthy. So I would start by saying, going back to that data that said only 20% of health outcomes really has to do with clinical care, and a subset of that obviously is our important medicines and vaccines. I think it's important for us to address the other 80% to make sure that people are able to get access to high quality care. And as part of high quality care and prevention, then we can start to think about how we can get these medicines. And the big barrier, let's put it on the table, is the cost of these medicines and vaccines, right? So if we're going to address this, the industry alone can't do it. We've been down in Washington for many, many decades trying to address this issue about whether cost is a fundamental barrier to access to our medicines and vaccines. And of course, to some degree, the pricing of medicines is a barrier. But there's also a huge issue around who has access to the right kind of coverage.
Yes, insurance.
Right? Insurance, right? And so we live in a country where, for most people, if they have decent insurance, and a lot of people don't have decent insurance, if they go to have inpatient care, they're going to pay 3 to 5%, where they're going to pay 13 to 15% of their drug costs. So if we can't find a way to work with, and I'm not pointing fingers at PBMs and insurance companies, if all of us can't come together to come up with a rational system that actually allows people to have reasonable access to these medicines, then I'm afraid we're going to have a system imposed on us by governments.
Right. Given the current situation in the U.S. with gun violence on the rise, which poses more than just a health problem, what would your advice be to tackle this problem?
So your audience asks really good, hard questions, right? So I'm living in Philadelphia, which is becoming, unfortunately, one of the homicide capitals of the United States, right? And so there are a couple of issues, one of which is, I'm just going to state my view that certain weapons, which are incredibly lethal, like AR-15s and other automatic weapons, I don't see that there's any social utility in having these weapons available. Until the mid-1990s, we had an assault weapon ban. And I understand the challenges around convincing people that we respect their Second Amendment rights, but the lethality of those weapons, and we saw what happened to those children in Texas. We see what's happening on the streets of our country every day. I just think there has to be some reasonable regulation of guns and access to those guns without violating people's right to the Second Amendment. I think that's one issue. I think the underlying issue, though, comes back to the issues we've been talking about all the time. There are real mental health issues in our country. There's a pandemic of poverty and hopelessness in our country. So the young men that are out in the streets, often killing each other, they're bereft of hope. And it comes back to what I was saying before about why it's important for things like 110 for people to have opportunities to have access to the kinds of jobs that will allow them to have family-sustaining wages, et cetera. These are all multifaceted things, but I do think at the end of the day, we can't just solve the gun problem or the homicide problem without looking at the underlying issues that we have in terms of the absolute lack of hope for a lot of people.
Definitely. And I want to wrap up now. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. What lessons or skills would you recommend to researchers and students with potential interest in pharmaceutical leadership positions?
What I would recommend to anyone is what I've learned looking back on life is that if you aspire to leadership in organizations like this, it's the breadth of what your experience is that matters. You know, very often all of us are taught to be really expert at something, and I think that's necessary to be expert at something. But to become leaders in complex, again, multidisciplinary, interdependent companies like Merck, what I found very early on, as I said, when I was brought here as a lawyer, I was sort of kicked out of the legal department and made to learn other areas. And that made me feel really insecure because I was always the person in the room at the beginning who knew the least about what I was doing. But I've learned over a long time that it's sort of better to know a little about a lot than to know a lot about a little if you aspire to leadership in a company that's complex and interdependent like Merck. So that would be my answer.
So specializing versus being a generalist.
Yeah, I think they both have importance. Specialization is good because you need a certain amount of depth of knowledge, but there's also a curse of specialization too.
Yes.
And I think if people who aspire to leadership in companies generally are people who are willing to learn. It's one thing to be a knowledge person, it's another thing to be a learning person.
Learning person versus knowledge, yes. One fun question, what is a book or piece of art that has your attention right now? Or is there a particular book or piece of art that influenced you as a student?
Oh, absolutely. I'll take the latter one, Steve.
Okay.
So I remember reading a book. It's an old book. It's called Simple Justice. And it's the book about the history of the civil rights movement through the lens of a courageous bunch of lawyers who I had not heard of at that time. You know, when we talk about the civil rights movements in our country, we generally talk about Dr. King and the civil disobedience that occurred after the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. But if you go back to the 40s, Thurgood Marshall and lawyers were actively involved in dismantling separate but equal in the South and racial discrimination in the South. And I didn't know that story about the work that they did that led up to the seminal case of Brown versus Board of Education. And so that's what was the most influential thing to me. If I had to pick another thing, when I was a child, I remember reading the book To Kill a Mockingbird, and I said, I really want to be a lawyer.
Oh, wow. That inspired you.
Yes.
Wow. So thinking ahead, now that it has been almost a year since you've retired as Merck's CEO, where have you put your focus?
Well, I talked a little bit about, so I'm spending my time on a few things. I am working along with an organization called General Catalyst, which helps startup companies. It's a venture capital fund that actually helps startup companies grow. And I've been focusing on, I'm chairman of what they call health assurance there, where we're really working on the companies in the healthcare space. 110 that we talked about earlier is where I'm spending a significant amount of time. And I'm also trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up, because I'm not really sure after I stop being executive chairman of Merck what it is that I'm going to do.
And if you were able to do it again, would you have done anything differently in your career?
Oh, sure, I would have done a lot of things differently, but I have to say, if I had to pick one thing, I would have been more willing earlier to take more adventure, to take more risk, to try to learn different things rather than to be worrying only about mastering one thing. Okay?
Is there any last piece of advice or closing you'd like to say to us?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their generous attention here, and just to say to the scientists on this webcast that the world owes you a great debt of gratitude. The work that you do in your labs, the work that you do in clinics, it's what's going to be important to the health of the world going forward. So I'm just really grateful to be in some way associated with you.
Thank you. And we'd like to present you with the Lasker Foundation plaque as a token of appreciation for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending our Lasker Lessons leadership conversation with Mr. Ken Frazier. I hope you leave this live stream as inspired as I am, and if we were in person, I can imagine the round of applause that we'd receive. Our next Lasker Lessons in Leadership event will be November 14th, featuring the President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath. And it will be moderated by NIH-Oxford scholar Kenneth C. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.